Back here now on the show to talk some more now in the NFC about predicting what this Eagles offense can look like in 2024. Where I thought the biggest issue with the Eagles last year was their defense. I thought they made more mistakes on that side of the ball. Their offense wasn't totally faultless or flawless in what they produced out there on the field, especially when you talk about the lack of pre-snap movement, which is what we're going to talk about in this segment. Since the NFL in the last few years has become so enamored with offense, high-scoring games, more so favoring the offense than the defense, it has naturally evolved into seeing a lot more pre-snap motion, a lot more deception, tricking the defense, showing them something, and then quickly moving out of it at the last second, changing coverages up. It all really is very hard when you look at it and thinking about being involved in that. It seems extremely hard, but if you look further into that and how naturally it has evolved into more pre-snap movement and more deception, you look at some teams that are very successful with it, like the 49ers, who of their offensive plays had a player in motion before the snap. That was up there at 70%. You look at the Kansas City Chiefs also at 60% in offensive plays that had a player in motion before the snap. Both of those teams were in the top four of having, a player in motion before the ball was snapped, and obviously both of them, no secret, they were in the Super Bowl. Not to say that that was the main reason or only reason why, but it's certainly there is a little bit of a connection there between the motion and how their offenses are looking compared to the Philadelphia Eagles. Because in terms of talent, in all honesty, right now it's hard to say that another team is 100% more talented than this Eagles team. If you look at Saquon, A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, Jalen Hurts, all these guys, I just named 5 to 6 players right there. I don't think any offense just in the NFC or just in the NFL alone can name the type of quality and quantity that the Eagles have at those positions and really go toe-to-toe with them. So why did this offense look so poor in 2023? Well, it has to do a lot with that motion, like I mentioned, and they brought in Kellen Moore this offseason to try and change that a little bit, because under the offense of Brian Johnson last year and almost Nick Sirianni as well, it really didn't look very smooth, very much like everybody was on the same page. There was a lot of just confused looks out there, errant throws by Jalen Hurts, and it very much stuttered, especially once they got to the red zone. It didn't look as efficient as it did in previous years. So I thought I'd compare it a little bit, look more into the situation between Kellen Moore and his offense compared to Nick Sirianni and what they were doing last year with Brian Johnson. If you look at here, some of the things I wrote down on the screen, under Nick Sirianni, the Philadelphia Eagles, 26% of the time had a player that went in motion 26% of the time. That was last in the NFL last season, and they were the only team that had a player in motion that was under 30% of their offensive plays. So there's one thing, there's that, and there's also the fact that since Nick Sirianni became the head coach and almost has had a big impact on how this offense has been run, Philadelphia has sent a wide receiver in motion on 30% of their plays, which is the fewest of any team in the NFL during that period of Nick Sirianni being the head coach. The NFL average during this time of Sirianni being in charge of the Philadelphia Eagles has been at as high as 47%, and also has increased even last year at 48% of the time seeing a player go in motion across the NFL. The average of seeing that has been nearly half of the time of the entire offensive plays this year. You've seen a player go in motion, and that's an extremely high number. It just shows you the way the NFL is played now, with a lot of offensive movement. These offensive coordinators are getting a lot more creative in trying to trick opposing defenses and trying to get guys a lot more open. Maybe not so much based on talent, but based on how they're scheming them open is a good way of putting it. And so more on this Nick Sirianni offense. With this offense not having as much motion, as much trickery and deception to it, and trying to confuse opposing defenses, it has almost become pretty stale and almost predictable. With all the talent that they have, if the opposing defense knows what you're running, or you're not really doing anything to throw them off their game, if they're calling out what the play most likely is going to be before the snap and you're still calling it, all the talent could really just not intimidate the opposing defense, and you're getting all those confused looks like you did in 2023. And the amount of big plays was a big thing that really decreased from last season, or I should say from 2022 to 2023. And before I get to that, Eric, is Nick Sirianni coaching for his job? He did lose both offensive and defensive coordinators last year. That's a great point. I think he is. I think he truly is this year because of the offense not looking great last year and how much he had a voice into that, but also you're not going to move on. Who do you put the blame on if this year doesn't look great like it did last year? I don't think they get rid of Jalen Hurts. You're probably not going to get rid of anybody else on offense, or you're not going to try and move on from coordinators again because Kellen Moore has been a pretty established offensive mind. You brought in Vic Fangio on the defensive side of the ball. So I think just by default, Nick Sirianni has been there for a good amount of years, and the narrative mostly around this team has been that they're very talented, and maybe Nick Sirianni doesn't have too much to do with how good they look at times. So I think just by default, he might be the scapegoat here, and the team would have no other choice but to move on from him because, again, I don't think they move on from Jalen Hurts. He's been there almost the same amount of time, but to find another starting quarterback that could do what Jalen Hurts can do, and he always says the right things. He always does the right thing and looks the part of a franchise quarterback. They're not going to move on from him. So I just think that this year Sirianni is definitely coaching for his job, like you put it there, Eric. But more so on this team and how the offense just looked from 2022 to 2023. The amount of big plays that they had, down the field went down. Philadelphia had only 16 plays of 20-plus yards from Week 13 through Week 18, which was tied for 26th in the NFL during that span. And also, in the entirety of last year, they only had 7 plays of 25 yards or more down the field, which was tied for 30th in the NFL, only ahead of the Carolina Panthers. No disrespect to the Panthers, but anytime you're close in a stat to them, you're most likely not considered one of the best teams. That's just how it is. Last year, maybe the Panthers are a lot better this year, but last year, their offense, how it looked with Bryce Young, with Frank Reich, and not having as many playmakers. The fact that the Philadelphia Eagles were close to them in any statistical category with how much better their offense is speaks a lot to just how this scheme was played out in 2023. So now Kellen Moore arrives, and if you look at him last season with the Los Angeles Chargers, he ran a top 6 offense in terms of motion, having a player in motion about 59% of the time in what he calls and how he schemes his offense. And if you go back even further than that, in 2019 through 2022, he had a player go in motion about 44% of the time with the Dallas Cowboys. And arguably those were the beginning years and some of the most prolific years for the Dallas Cowboys in terms of offense and how crazy some of the numbers they put up with Dak, with Zeke, I want to say too, and also towards the end of that, CeeDee Lamb. So Kellen Moore has pretty much adapted very well to this new motion offense and has done a very good job of making it look pretty efficient and very well. You can make an argument that without Kellen Moore last year, the offense for the Los Angeles Chargers could have potentially been even worse or not looked as smooth as it did because of how just dysfunctional it was. I thought he did a very good job on offense, and a lot of the time it really didn't bog down to him calling a bad play or anything. It always looked smooth, but with the lack of talent that they had there, it wasn't a great situation for him in Los Angeles. So now it's looking a bit more positive here in Philadelphia, and Devontae Smith commented on this new offense that everyone is trying to learn by saying, I think it's going to be great. Get a new style of offense around, let guys not have more freedom, but be able to do things that we weren't allowed to do last year. So I thought that was pretty interesting to use the word that they weren't allowed to last year. I thought was pretty noteworthy there. So they're pretty excited. A.J. Brown had some things to say about it. So they certainly have the talent. The good part about changing their scheme and going to more motion is that this team has to adapt because that's how it is in the NFL nowadays. If your team is pretty much stuck in its philosophies, it's stuck in its traditions of this old school mentality, a lot of the times you don't see those teams really prospering or really considered one of the main contenders in the NFL or just in their conference in general. Very rarely do you see a team do things their own way, and they're the only team that does that, and they're still considered one of the best teams in the NFL. You have to adapt, or else you run the risk of being left behind and being stuck in this rut of just average to bad years, and you have to get out of that, especially with the talent that the Philadelphia Eagles have on their roster. I go back to that because they're too talented to limit themselves on offense by having a play caller not adapt to how the NFL is adjusting nowadays and not have all this motion incorporated in their offense. They're way too talented to not have that do that and to really just hurt themselves in that aspect. So that's another thing about it. The only negative will be that having so much motion, having so much movement before the line, everybody almost has to be in sync and on a rope. That's an expression you use on defense most of the time in most sports, but with the offense now, having maybe one player go in motion and having another signal go to the other side of the field to another wide receiver, or just how the play is supposed to line up in terms of when the ball is snapped, depending on where the receiver is in his motion. There's a lot of little nuances that will take a lot more time to get used to learn, and there's definitely going to have to be more communication on this offense, and the timing is going to be pivotal to make this look as tricky, as confusing as it can be for opposing defenses. And you do run the risk of some more pre-snap penalties if one guy doesn't know the cadence or doesn't know that this other guy's going in motion or isn't lined up properly. All those little things are going to maybe pop up more if these players aren't so locked in all the time. And that's what it requires with this motion offense, and that's why not a lot of teams are as efficient in doing it. If you do it a lot, which is, the given nowadays, but you also add the efficiency onto it, that's where you get the Kansas City Chiefs, that's where you get the San Francisco 49ers, the Detroit Lions as well to a certain extent. That's where you really get to that next level of being a great football team. The Eagles certainly have all the tools to do that, but now they just have to go out, learn it, first of all, and go execute it. I think they could do it. They're very much a top contender in the NFC. I expect them to bounce back after last year, especially Jalen Hurts. I thought he had a down year, but I think this year everything's put in place for him with Saquon, with this new offense that I think is definitely going to benefit him to bounce back in 2024. Hopefully that happens. Hopefully we get some good competitive games there, but that'll be it for that segment. We're going to move on to the next break of the show, and when we return, two new segments to talk about. We're going to go into Stephon Gilmore and where he could potentially be landing in 2024. He's been a top free agent all this time. It's been a surprise that no one has signed him. We're going to look more into that. And also the Los Angeles Rams now recently revealing through a documentary that they almost made a massive trade in the first round of the NFL draft. What was that trade and who was it with? Stick around to find out more on those two topics when we return in just a few seconds.